Okay, next news topic. This week, the Asus ROG Ally was actually updated. New BIOS, new drivers, and which is great, right? Because these handhelds really do need to, really stand to benefit from having these driver updates. The ROG Ally has improved beyond measure since I first looked at it. One of the new updates that was added to the ROG Ally was AMD Fluid Motion Frames, AFMF. Which is effectively a very basic form of frame generation, right? Driver level, works on any DX11 or DX12 game. And if you think about what a handheld does, essentially, you can get away with a lot more nips and tucks to a game's presentation, and it will still look pretty decent on a 7-inch screen. And frame generation for a handheld, well, this is pretty cool. And frame generation for a handheld that has a 120 hertz VRR screen, well, potentially even better, right? Because one of the limitations of AFMF is that it only works if VSync is completely disabled, which isn't great unless you have a VRR screen, because it will just go into the VRR window and away you go. So I gave it a go. First of all, I gave it a go with Cyberpunk 2077. So to begin with here, you're looking at the baked-in benchmark sequence. And what I've done here is to cap the frame rate to 35 frames per second. And you should be able to see, well, first of all, you've got the frame rate counter from the game on the left there. You've got the Riva Tuner frame rate counter in the bottom right there, 35 FPS capped. Top right, you have got the AMD overlay, which is basically saying that the game is running at 70 frames per second. So this is frame generation doing the job, right? It's doubling the frame rate with interpolated frames. And because it is like a 7-inch screen, it kind of holds up. It looks pretty decent. So yes, potentially a really exciting addition to the ROG Ally. The thing is, though, and this is sort of a limitation with AFMF that AMD has baked in here, which is that if there's a lot of movement on screen, AMD has sort of arbitrarily decided this is going to look a bit poor. So they basically disable AFMF for that particular period. The upshot being you lose the fluidity. And it kind of happens in the benchmark sequence there, but it's more of an issue in the drive-through streaming benchmarks that we use. And we don't have the CD Projekt Red FPS counter there, but you do have Riva Tuner in the bottom right, and you have AMD's frame rate counter, which includes AFMF on the top right there. And you can see that, basically we're always at 35 frames per second, according to Riva Tuner, but according to AMD, the frame rate is changing quite radically at any given point, and it doesn't really look particularly good.
No.
To the point where I'm thinking maybe I should just stick with the capped 35 or go up to 40 or whatever. Basically let the VRR screen do more of the heavy lifting. So yeah, that's basically my thoughts on AFMF. It's okay, but it's not great. And I do think, I don't know, Alex, because you've looked at this in the past, and this arbitrary sort of switch off thing is a bit disconcerting, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's just not very, like, you get that like added fluidity at like for certain camera motions that are otherwise already semi-fluid anyways, based because you think about it, like it's the when it's turning off is when it's just detecting a larger discontinuity in the previous frame and the current frame. And that's, it's turning on for the frames that are most similar to one another. So you're already seeing like the least amount of added motion there anyway. But then for the frames when you really want more motion, it's turning off. So it's looking like even more jarring. And I don't like that behavior so much. I think it's nice that they have it for those people that do not want to see errors in their game images. But I think it would make a lot of sense if AMD made it more configurable. If AFMF could be, you could turn this behavior on and off separately. That'd be very helpful, especially for mouse users.
I mean, you could have
Yeah.
the threshold you could have possibly, or just straight, just give me those frames regardless.
Yeah.
Which I think, for the ROG Ally in particular, when you've got like a 7-inch screen, it's like, well, yes, there's going to be visual discontinuities by leaving it on all the time, but I actually am okay with that, as opposed to the jarring stutter that you get when it turns itself off. So I also looked at a Plague Tale Requiem, and you can see I did the same thing there. I sort of limited the frame rate and let AFMF double it. And yeah, basically whenever you have these sort of sweeping camera changes, typically when I'm sort of spinning around the character using the third-person camera there, it kind of doesn't really look great. It's quite really interesting to see that when it is working, there are still visual discontinuities, around the main character and stuff. But, I think it kind of works all right, except once again, it turns itself off. So everybody says, well, look at lossless scaling frame generation, which is a tool that you can download from Steam. It's very, very cheap. I think it was about £5.80 when I looked at it. And as the name implies, it does lossless scaling, including integer scaling, which is nice. But what it also does is frame generation. So I gave it a go in a Plague Tale, 30 to 60. And there's just too many errors. It's fine, again, on very, very sort of gradual movement. But I think 30 to 60 is too much of a leap for it. And maybe it is. I mean, I'm seeing a lot of people swearing by this tool, saying it's great and awesome for the ROG Ally. And maybe it is in certain games. And I did, admittedly just give it a look in a Plague Tale. But, it didn't really do the job for me. There's some jarring issues there.
Oh, I see it. I'm looking at the footage now. There's a lot of artifacting, like this warbling effect on the fringes of the camera. When you do that panning shot in the middle of all the grass, the frame gen is just struggling to keep up and understand what information it's getting from the edge of the frame. It's really poor. Well, impressive for, as a quick hack solution. I suppose if you pair that with motion blur and a small screen, you might disguise it.
I actually used motion blur there because I turned off motion blur in a Plague Tale and repeated the exercise, and it actually highlighted artifacts a lot more. I'm guessing it's a lot easier to interpolate a frame that's kind of two blurred frames as opposed to two that are packed with detail. Now, I might have got it all wrong with lossless scaling frame gen, because I'm reading, Alex, we were talking about this yesterday.
Yes.
It sounds so great that, people should have the portrait of the developer in their toilets.
Yes. Second coming. But
but it just doesn't really work in that specific scenario for the ROG Ally. But what I will say, we've kind of written off 30 to 60 frame gen. But I've got to say, there are certain examples with DLSS 3 where it kind of works pretty well. Cyberpunk 2077 path tracing, you can have 60 FPS with frame gen, and I prefer it to not having frame gen and running at 30. I also had some pretty good success with Horizon Forbidden West, which is surprising, bearing in mind how detail rich it is. Best example, actually, I think you might have seen this yourself, Alex, DLSS 3 with Alan Wake 2.
Yeah, I did try
30 to 60. Actually looks pretty decent. I was quite surprised by that.
Actually, a surprise for a lot of people who don't know. A lot of the content for my video that I did on Alan Wake 2 was 30 to 60 FPS up. I'd used the DLSS quality mode there, and I ran the game in 30 to 60, and I recorded it. So
yeah, it doesn't officially support VSync.
Yeah, it doesn't.
DLSS 3, but there are games like Horizon, like Alan Wake, that actually seem to run okay if you force VSync on at the driver level, and even the latency isn't that bad. So, seems to be holding up. Very interesting there. But that's basically what I'm saying and what I'm seeing with AFMF on the ROG Ally. Interesting tool. I'd really like to see a configurability added to the function, though, to actually stop the disabling of AFMF, because I think it could actually be rather good. I did actually try a Plague Tale with AFMF, and not surprisingly, when it wasn't disabling itself, it was producing a more likable effect than lossless frame gen. So yeah, but great, but not great when it turns itself off.
Yeah, you're suddenly down to 45 FPS or so.
Yeah, it's just a bit weird, but an interesting enhancement nonetheless. And it is great to see these AMD features making their way across to the ROG Ally.